And she's going to speak about the role of machine learning in creating a greener future. So please welcome Priya, and you should be able to share your screen on your end. You're also on mute.
Okay, did that work? It's a blank screen. So
give it 1 second. Okay. It's a black screen.
Great, good. Yeah, so I guess before starting, I really want to thank the organizers for putting this event together. It is super difficult to put on a virtual event, and it's been going really well. So thank you so much for that. All right, so to get started, so I want everyone to kind of close your eyes for a sec and imagine a future where we as a society have figured out how to effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the consequences of a changing climate. Where, for example, we're able to analyze satellite imagery to pinpoint exactly where and when greenhouse gases are being emitted to inform the actions of policymakers and industry leaders alike. Or where, for example, when the wind blows and is converted to electricity, we can automatically adjust the timings of our industrial equipment to take advantage of this clean power. Or where we can predict droughts or famines or floods caused by climate change before they occur, providing early warning to farmers or evacuation planners. So, did you imagine those things? If you did, you might be waiting for me to tell you what the key is to that future that I just described, to tell you the one secret that will get us there. And given the title of my talk, you might be anticipating that the answer is machine learning. So machine learning is a branch of artificial intelligence describing techniques that can help automatically extract patterns from data, usually large amounts of data. And that's really it, extracting patterns in data. Even though this concept seems simple, it's applicable in a lot of places, enabling machine learning to have broad impact in a variety of areas, ranging from healthcare to making industrial processes more efficient. So, is machine learning the key to tackling climate change? No. You see, I do think machine learning can be an important part of many strategies to tackle climate change. It's what's under the hood of our ability to analyze greenhouse gases in satellite images, or to quickly optimize industrial equipment, or to forecast droughts. But climate change is complex. It's an extremely multifaceted issue. For starters, there are many different sectors that contribute to emissions, from electricity supply to heavy industry to agriculture and more. There are many ways that society will need to adapt, from designing hurricane-proof infrastructure to securing our food systems to addressing epidemics and health risks. There are many different kinds of stakeholders that need to be involved in taking these actions: researchers, entrepreneurs, policymakers, NGOs, the world's biggest emitters, and frontline communities alike. And given this vast and complex picture, you can imagine that there's no one key or one thing that will fix the entirety of climate change. We'll need many tools in our toolkit, from traditional engineering and policy analysis to the social sciences, and also including machine learning. So today I am going to focus in on machine learning, why it's important, what it can do, and also what it can't do, but then try to zoom back out and contextualize machine learning within this bigger picture that you see. But before I dive into the details, I want to tell you a little bit about how I started working in this area. So I've known that I wanted to work on climate change since my freshman year of high school, when one of my high school teachers dedicated a class period to the topic. During that class, we learned that climate change was likely to affect the world's most vulnerable populations the most. And this spoke to me as a really important issue for humanity to try to solve. So I knew I wanted to work on climate change, but I didn't know exactly how. I went to college with some vague notion that maybe I would try to study material science and create next generation solar panels. But then something unexpected happened, which is that I fell in love with my computer science classes. And this put me into a bit of a conundrum. It wasn't at all clear to me how I could continue to work on computer science while at the same time working to address climate change. Fortunately, I soon came across a paper called Putting the Smarts into the Smart Grid by a group of researchers in the UK that helped me start to figure out a way. That paper talked about how machine learning and artificial intelligence would be important drivers in helping us create a more intelligent grid powered by renewables like solar and wind, which in turn was important for addressing climate change. And I was hooked. After college, I spent a year interviewing people around the world who were working on next generation electricity systems, and then started my PhD working on applications of machine learning in this area. So that's a bit of my story. But in parallel, there were lots of other stories going on. In particular, people were coming from different directions, realizing that they too felt like machine learning had something to offer in tackling the climate crisis. For instance, Lynn Koch, a climate change and policy researcher who had noticed that using machine learning to analyze satellite imagery could help fill crucial gaps in climate relevant information. Or David Rolnick, a researcher studying the mathematics of machine learning, who had realized the importance of mobilizing the machine learning community to address what is one of the most important issues of our time. So the next part of the story started when these and many other parallel stories combined, and a team of about 20 of us came together to write a paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning. In this paper, we tried to address and enumerate the most impactful ways that machine learning could be used to reduce the extent of climate change and adapt to its unavoidable consequences. And it turns out there are a lot of ways. So I'm obviously not going to be able to recount the full findings of this paper right now. It's something like 60 pages long, but I can try to give a little bit of a summary. So in the paper, we found that there are a few key ways that machine learning can help us take action on climate change. One of these is by turning large amounts of raw data that aren't immediately useful into actionable insights. So this can take a few different forms. For example, forecasting. Machine learning can take data like historical weather or cloud cover or the locations of solar farms and help us predict how much solar power is going to be produced in the next few hours. This can provide valuable insight to power grid operators who are trying to balance the power grid. Or to come back to an example I gave earlier, we can analyze remote sensing data like satellite imagery to produce maps of greenhouse gas emissions, but also to do things like identify the efficiency characteristics of buildings or to pinpoint and therefore help prevent deforestation. So that's one big theme, turning raw data into insights. Another big theme is that machine learning can help make basic science and engineering faster. So for instance, climate simulation models are really large and really slow. And so they tend to produce insights that are averaged over large regions that are not very local or specific. And this makes it hard to get local insights on how the climate will look in a particular city or small region, even though those insights would be really useful in helping city governments come up with disaster plans or helping farmers account for how changes in weather will affect what they can grow. So machine learning can help approximate or speed up or otherwise downscale, quote unquote, parts of climate models in order to help us get better localized insights like this. So that's the second theme, accelerating science and engineering. And then the third big theme, or a third big theme, is improving the efficiency of real-world systems. So for instance, when you order something online, that has to be supplied by some entity, some manufacturer, for example, and then transported to you via trains or trucks or boats. These global supply chains and freight transportation systems are large and not necessarily as efficient as they could be. Machine learning can help consolidate shipments or re-optimize the system in case of delays in order to improve the overall efficiency. And there are many other examples in addition to freight transportation that are like this. So those are the three big themes: turning raw data into insights, accelerating science and engineering, and improving the efficiency of systems. And while I've only given a few specific examples in a few specific sectors here, these themes are reflected again and again in climate change strategies across energy, land use, policy, and so on. So what I hope this demonstrates is that there are a lot of things that machine learning can help us with. And I would definitely argue that it should be in our toolkit for tackling climate change. At the same time, as promised, I want to zoom back out to this bigger picture to emphasize that machine learning really is only one piece of the puzzle, that it's not going to be the thing that helps us solve climate change. So, for instance, let's take my example of solar forecasting from earlier. While forecasting solar power using machine learning can give us insights, these insights need to be used by someone. For instance, an electricity system operator who wants to balance the power grid to emit less and be more resilient to unexpected events. Power system operators often use engineering and optimization models to balance the grid, and the way this is done is often informed by policy decisions. So we then need to figure out how to incorporate these forecasts into power system models so they can actually inform this optimization process. Which is to say, there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of people who are needed to go from the insight provided by the machine learning model to action. So to give another example, let's take the example I talked about of downscaling climate models. In order to do this, we have to incorporate data analysis from machine learning with scientific knowledge from the climate model, with the knowledge that, for instance, Indigenous and frontline communities have aggregated over generations. We need to work closely with farmers and city planners and NGOs and frontline communities to make sure these insights are actually useful for taking action. Which is to say, there's a huge amount of domain and stakeholder knowledge that comes into play and needs to be incorporated along the insight provided by the machine learning application. So finally, let's take the example of optimizing global supply chains. So while machine learning may help make these systems more efficient, many firms aren't optimizing for emissions, they're optimizing for costs. And if you make a system lower cost, chances are it's going to get used more, potentially negating its emissions benefits. This is called the Jevons paradox. And then also with machine learning and analytics solutions, it's often the entities with more knowledge and more power who are able to take advantage of them, which often then boxes out smaller players. So this is a case where machine learning can potentially have unintended consequences unless we work closely with policymakers, market players, and other stakeholders to make sure our use of machine learning is aligned with both equity and climate impacts. So this was our message in our paper, that machine learning is an important tool, but that it's one piece. It should be implemented in a way that considers its potential side effects and that jives well with all of the moving parts that are needed to make it impactful. So we released our paper alongside a workshop that we held in June 2019 on climate change and machine learning. And as you can see, the room at the workshop was packed. The excitement was palpable. But along with this excitement came a lot of questions from attendees along the lines of, how do I start and how do I connect with the right people to get involved? Or how do I navigate this big, complex picture that you've told me exists? So these questions got us started on the path of creating Climate Change AI, an initiative to facilitate impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning. Our goal has been to clear bottlenecks to working in this area by providing resources and helping people connect, but also to make sure that this work is done in a way that is actually impactful, in a way that's aware not only of the benefits of machine learning, but also its potential side effects and the huge responsibility that comes along with doing work in this area. So to do this, we've held workshops and events at machine learning conferences and at the UN Climate Change Conference in order to help people share knowledge and encourage important discussions. We've created a host of digital resources, such as summaries of the applications in our paper, data sets, and a digital discussion forum. And we routinely provide advice to individuals and organizations who want to work in this area about machine learning strengths, limitations, and potential side effects in the context of climate change applications. By doing this, we hope to build a community encompassing researchers, engineers, entrepreneurs, investors, policymakers, companies, NGOs, you name it, from a variety of climate change sectors and from across the world, because that's the only way change is going to happen. if we all come together, learn together, and work together. So I've painted this big picture, but what does this mean for you? What can you do? Well, machine learning or not, I would encourage you to reflect on how you can use your unique skills and unique networks to make a dent in climate change. Talk to your friends and also to other people with different backgrounds from yours, and figure out together how to dive in while keeping this bigger systems picture in mind. And if you're interested in using machine learning specifically in this mix and you want to meet other people who are interested as well, I'd encourage you to check out Climate Change AI. You can, for example, join our digital discussion forum, tune into one of our upcoming virtual events. The next one is in December, I believe, or you can reach out. You don't necessarily need to know anything yet about machine learning to join in. Wherever you are in your machine learning journey or wherever you're physically located, we'd be happy to see you around. Because you see, only together, by bringing together all these different kinds of experiences and expertise, by working in parallel and complementary ways, can we implement holistic, effective, and equitable strategies to address the climate crisis. And maybe some of them will use machine learning. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Priya, for your presentation. I think it's really important to kind of emphasize the fact that it's really only one piece of the puzzle. And I love that that's the message of what you're sending out. We have one question. Oh, we have someone who is actually a recent member of Climate Change AI. And their question is, can quantum machine learning serve as a tool for tackling climate change?
That is a great question. Yeah. Quantum machine learning is certainly not my area of expertise. I'm going to punt a bit on that one. But I am aware of sort of a budding initiative that is trying to figure out how quantum computing in general can actually help tackle the climate crisis. So feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to learn more.
Yeah. And do you have your contact information somewhere?
I don't have it on the slide, but if you, I can send it in the chat. And also, if you look me up, I'm an academic, which means my email address is easily findable, hopefully.
So, yeah, if you could send it in the chat, that would be great.
Sure, sounds good.
Yeah, someone asked for your contact, and this is an interesting question. How can machine learning enable climate equity, given that there are cases where it kind of just reinforces the biases that we've already given it the training data?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And I think it comes down to the fact that machine learning is an amplifier in a lot of different ways. So it can help amplify kind of the effectiveness of the stakeholder you use it with, or the effectiveness of a particular application. And so what I'd really say is that in order to use machine learning to enable climate equity, you need to make sure that you're working with the right stakeholders. So for instance, if you're thinking about kind of increasing the efficiency of agriculture or helping farmers adapt to the effects of a changing climate, consider, for example, working with smaller farmers and sort of helping them leverage sort of some of the power of the machine learning algorithms, and as a result sort of help kind of even out some of these inequities that exist in society. So I think it's really about, yeah, the choice of who you choose to work with and where you choose to make your tools available, and also considerations around, even if you're not working directly with a stakeholder to implement something, like who has access in both in theory and in practice to actually using or gaining insight from the thing that you've developed.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really important. Someone also asked, could you share a few interesting outputs or findings from maybe running a model for one of your machine learning projects?
Sure. So I specifically work in energy systems for my own work. And so one thing I actually think a lot about is it's not just about whether the output is sort of traditionally accurate. So for example, I think a lot about forecasting solar and wind power. And what a lot of people do is they just try to make that forecast as accurate as possible. And on the one hand, that seems great, right? But on the other hand, what we actually care about is not whether the forecast is as accurate as possible. We care about whether a grid operator, for example, is able to balance the grid as well as possible based on the actual output of the forecast. So so some of the work that I've been doing is actually trying to figure out how to make the machine learning model sort of aware of the way that its output is going to be used. in order to then help it make better predictions that are more useful. So to make that more concrete, if I predict that there's going to be a ton of solar power on the grid, then a grid operator might actually just reduce the amount of other like fossil fuel generation that's coming onto the grid. And if that prediction is wrong, then we may not have enough power generation. So that kind of thing is what the machine learning algorithm should be in some sense taking into account. And so to sort of answer, to sort of come back a little more directly to the question, I think it's not often just about, what is an interesting phenomenon that the machine learning algorithm identified or spit out. I think it's also, how does that interesting phenomenon, how do you measure how interesting that is? How do you measure how useful that is? And how do you incorporate that kind of thinking with actually like the process through which it would actually be used in practice? So I know that was sort of a more indirect answer to that question, but hopefully that was useful.
No, I think that's helpful because algorithms never exist in a vacuum. Their outputs are always used by somebody. I guess I'm curious, how much do you spend time thinking about like what could go wrong?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And as a researcher, I think actually a lot of us, like in general, a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about, what is the right research problem to be working on? What's the right question to ask? And then sometimes that is the harder part than actually executing it sometimes. And so I would say that a lot of time in there goes into thinking about, like what could go wrong, sort of like what are the implications of the question I'm asking? But I guess I don't view it as like an undue burden. In some sense, it's sort of already incorporated into the way that we think about actually forming these questions. And it's just about making sure that instead of just thinking about, am I scoping the problem correctly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions very quickly, also just bringing other information into that calculation. So I guess to answer the question, not like a fair amount of time, but not necessarily a fair amount of sort of, it doesn't like bring an undue burden, I guess, into the actual process of doing the project.
Yeah, for sure. And that kind of goes back to your previous point of kind of making sure who has access to this and who has a voice in
Exactly.
the process. We have a couple more questions. I think we can take them since the next activity is breakout session. So in many developing countries, like data is not even available or publicly collected. Where do you see that? How can they start with even using any machine learning that relies on so much input data?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So one of the kind of groups of things that I talked about machine learning can do is actually help us sort of gather data. So what this means, for example, is if you have something like satellite imagery, which is available across the world, you can use that to actually map some of this information in places where it's not collected in other ways. So for example, there have been projects that have used satellite imagery to figure out where electricity infrastructure is in countries where it's not mapped. And so I would say that that is a place to start, realizing that the kind of measurements you're going to get from satellite imagery are never going to be as good as the measurements you would get through more kind of targeted methods. But one thing I've heard from various policymakers in developing countries is that often they want to argue for, we need some capability to collect data. And the people above them will say, well, we're only going to give you the ability to collect this data if you can prove to us that it's going to be useful. And they say, well, we can't prove to you that it's going to be useful unless we have some of this data. So there's this kind of lock. And so I think one of the ways to sort of break this lock is to sort of collect some of this approximate data from places like satellite imagery so that the policymakers in these countries can sort of start to demonstrate, look, if I actually have access to some of this data, this is what I can do with it. And that can sort of enable sort of a chain reaction of then kind of collecting more targeted data that is going to be more accurate in that context.
Great, yeah, thank you for sharing. I think the next two questions are kind of on the same theme. How do you go about like bridging the gap between research, academia, getting these models to be used in practice, and how much do you see like grid operators actually using these models now, or is it something that's 5-10 years out?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So grid operators, I think a lot of them are using machine learning for forecasting. So like for solar and wind forecasting, and some of them are at various stages of doing that. But in some sense, it's because that's easy, right? They already have some way of trying to predict solar and wind. this is a potentially better way of helping predict solar and wind, and they already know how to incorporate that into the way that they optimize the grid in some way. So in that sense, I think that figuring out, yeah, so I think that is one way that it's definitely being used. I think the way in which it's being done a lot in academia, but is not being moved into industry, is actually in the process of the grid optimization itself. There's sort of a culture conflict where if you're a power system operator, you need to make sure the grid stays on. If something goes off because you tried something fancy, then you get in a lot of trouble, and a lot of people, have experienced hardship because of that. So that's tricky, and I think that there have been various ways that people have tried to sort of bridge this gap between research and implementation. For instance, RTE France, like France's operator, is currently running a challenge to try to see if reinforcement learning can be used to help manage their grid. And they're kind of putting out like benchmarks and test cases and sort of smaller things that they're sort of designing to say, okay, if we can answer this question about power system optimization, then this is the next question we want answered. This is the next question we want answered. And they're sort of building a series of challenges to try to get those insights incorporated. So that's coming from the electricity system operator side. And then coming from the researcher side, I think it's just about like really trying to get yourself into these spaces that like go like work with an electricity system operator for a bit if you can, for example. And see what problems they're actually facing and see sort of how their processes work, et cetera, et cetera. There isn't really an easy answer beyond honestly like making sure that you're interacting with each other and really getting to understand each other's processes, et cetera. But yeah, that's sort of the way to do it, I think.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, yes, one more question. Is there anyone using machine learning to kind of predict, prevent, manage wildfires in California? Very timely.
Yeah, for sure. So people are working on different aspects of this puzzle. So I think there are, for example, some kind of early stage proposals that are trying to use machine learning along with the fluid dynamics models to actually figure out how wildfires are going to spread. And then in terms of like causes of wildfires, there are people who are looking at things like how do you figure out, whether your infrastructure is going to break and as a result spark something. But I think the challenging part is none of these things, I mean, I guess to echo some of the themes in my talk, none of these things alone is going to prevent wildfires. There are many different instances where, for example, somebody did know that a part of the electricity infrastructure was not kept up to date. I think this is a huge, of course, political issue with PG&E in particular. So they had the insight, but they need to act on the insight. And so I think, yes, there's machine learning being used to sort of predict or address various aspects of this problem. But I think the harder part is being sort of like bringing together the systems picture and really making sure that there are really the correct incentives to act and that people are actually using these insights to do something about it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think with that's all of our questions. Thank you so much for your talk. Really love kind of learning about your organization and all kind of the exciting work that you've done. And thanks for letting us pick your brain on so many different topics.
Yeah, it's been
great.
fun. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Yeah, for sure. And